Welcome to tonight's Ideas Speakers Forum. We're so glad that you've joined us. Um, I have a couple of things just to mention before we start. One is that we are going to keep everyone muted until we come to the question and answer section of our webinar tonight, and then we will give you opportunity to raise your hand, ask questions of Bill, and but until then, just to keep things smooth, we're going to keep everyone muted. I would suggest you go to the speaker view up in the right-hand corner under view so that you can most easily see Bill and benefit from his slides. And then the last thing is there will be a couple of times we're going to ask you to put some responses into the chat. So just look down at the bottom of your screen and know where that is. So by the way, I'm Barb Larson. I'm the Director of Community Life at Ideas. And again, I'm just so thrilled to welcome each of you to the Art of Critical Thinking. I want to introduce Dr. Merrifield very quickly because he's got a packed program for you tonight. So we want to get right to that. So Dr. Bill Merrifield served cross-culturally in Beirut, Lebanon for about 17 years. He holds a doctorate of education in educational leadership from George Fox University, an MA in Middle Eastern Studies from the American University of Beirut, an MA in religion from Trinity International University, and a BA in theology from Wheaton College. His experience includes roles in educational leadership and teaching in higher education, secondary education, and theological education. Dr. Merrifield's research is focused on the development of contextual critical thinking and contextual special education. His dissertation examined the impact of socio-contextual, cultural, and linguistic variables in the critical thinking processes of multilingual students. Dr. Merrifield currently lives in Wheaton, Illinois, and works as the Ideas Director of Education. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're looking forward to what you have for us tonight.
Thanks, Barb. Appreciate it. I want to thank all of you as well and welcome you. Thank you for taking the time to join me as we examine the art of critical thinking. As Barb mentioned before we get started, I did want to mention we have a lot to cover. I might run a little over the 1 hour into our question and answers, so let me apologize ahead of time if that takes place. And I want to let you know that if you need to leave at any time, please feel free to do that. Critical thinking is one of those words that I seem to hear everywhere. So whether people are talking about a lack of critical thinking or the importance of critical thinking or how a class requires critical thinking, the term is constantly being thrown around, especially in the field of education. And we're going to dive into that question in a minute. What is the art of critical thinking? But before we do that, I want to begin by exploring a few assumptions. And so I am going to launch a poll, and you'll have 2 minutes to answer the following questions. First question is, do you consider yourself a critical thinker? Yes or no? I'm going to give you 4 statements and ask you to choose which you think most accurately describes the purpose of critical thinking. And then I'm going to give you a list of values, and I want you to choose a maximum of 2 values that you think are the top 2 values when you think of critical thinking. I started this way because we all come to this discussion with our own assumptions. When you made a judgment about whether or not you're a critical thinker, that judgment was made probably fairly quickly based on your understanding of what critical thinking is, as well as a set of criteria you use to determine whether or not you yourself fit those criteria. And many times when I hear people talk about critical thinking, it reminds me of that famous line from the movie The Princess Bride, when Inigo Montoya says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." And as we begin to unpack this concept, you'll discover that in educational research, there's general agreement that critical thinking is important, but quite a bit of diversity over what is meant by that term. Actually, Dr. Tim Moore, in a qualitative study at an Australian university, interviewed 17 academics working in the disciplines of history, philosophy, and cultural studies. And from these 17 professors, he identified 7 different definitional strands of critical thinking. In addition, if you read the academic literature, You will find disagreement over foundational questions, such as whether critical thinking is primarily a set of skills, a disposition, or both. Is critical thinking simply Western individualistic analytic thinking? Is it creative thinking, original thinking? Is it problem solving? Is it logical thinking? Is it primarily about self-reflection? There's the question of whether or not critical thinking is a moral or an amoral activity. If it doesn't have a moral component, then you can use critical thinking skills to develop a deadly virus. But if it's a moral activity, then you can't use critical thinking toward destructive ends. And moral criteria must be established to evaluate whether or not someone is a critical thinker. There's also the question of whether or not critical thinking is the same thing across disciplines. For instance, is it the same in art as it is in biology? And then, is critical thinking an educational ideal, or is it simply a tool like other tools in education? In addition, there is debate over the purpose of critical thinking, which is why I had you answer that set of questions. Is it primarily concerned with the right or correct way of dealing with something, the most effective way, the most psychologically satisfying answer to a problem? Or is it simply descriptive, the different ways that groups respond to a problem or a question? As well as the values of critical thinking, they go all over the board, from autonomy and independence to questioning authority to respect to social connectivity to multiculturalism to coexistence. They can go all over the board as you look at the different literature. Now, in general, broadly speaking, there are two different schools of thought about critical thinking: the objectivist school and the subjectivist school. The objectivist school emphasizes the importance of objective, logical principles that can serve as criteria for evaluating beliefs across intellectual disciplines. And this school believes that the exercise of critical thinking should occur independent of the entanglements and pressures of a particular social context. And so these scholars focus on concepts such as impartiality, consistency, evidence-based data, identifying and avoiding biases, withholding judgment until enough data has been gathered to justify belief. And they also emphasize the importance of having a dispositional willingness to act based on evidence. And although scholars in the objectivist school do not agree on every aspect of critical thinking, they represent an approach that conceptualizes critical thinking as an objective, universal, rationalist process. And they highlight what they believe are transcultural and transdisciplinary skills that can be developed to facilitate linear thinking and attempt to establish standardized normative criteria upon which claims can be assessed as being reasonable or unreasonable, as well as good or bad. Now, the subjectivist school, these scholars reject the objectivist contention that there are transcultural and trans-domain criteria for evaluating and justifying belief. And instead, they ground critical thinking in domain-specific or socially located communities of discourse. So subjectivist scholars believe that logic is culturally specific. It's embedded within language and culture itself, and that different cultures have divergent or different rationalities. So if this is the case, culturally specific or domain-specific assumptions, skills, questions, and background knowledge are essential in the development and discussion and assessment of critical thinking. And if this is the case, critical thinking in art may look different than in biology, and critical thinking in India may look different than critical thinking in England. Now, some subjectivist scholars argue that critical thinking is not about right or logical or effective or pragmatic thinking. It's more concerned with meaningfulness and morality. Even others argue that critical thinking should be removed from its place as an educational ideal and assigned a modest role as an organizing, evaluating, and clarifying tool to be used constructively as you construct meaning alongside other tools of knowing, such as intuition and emotion. And so if we look at these two schools, we see that there's quite a bit of difference. So the main characteristics of the subjectivist school are culture-specific logic and criteria, whereas in the objectivist school, we see transcultural or trans-domain logic and criteria. In the subjectivist school, we see the aims to understand divergent communities of discourse. We see a willingness to act based on evidence, and we see a focus on meaningfulness and morality with values such as coexistence and respect and understanding and social connectivity. And we see that the subjectivist school de-elevates the importance of critical thinking as the desired mode of thinking and uses a subjective, rational process. And we'll unpack that a bit. Whereas in the objectivist school, as I mentioned, there's transcultural, trans-domain logic and criteria, with the aim being to withhold judgment until you have enough data gathered to justify belief. Similarly, there's a willingness to act based on evidence, but the values are very different: independence, autonomy, questioning authority, impartiality. And there's the idea that this is meant to occur outside the entanglements of social context, and that you are meant to use an objective, rational process. So if you look at these lists, you can see that the two schools disagree about the purposes, the uses, the limits, and values of critical thinking. Now, in general, objectivists and subjectivists both discuss the importance of skills and dispositions. So for example, critical thinking skill would be something like interpretation or analysis or evaluation or making inferences or self-regulation, regulating your process. Whereas dispositions are things such as seeking truth or open-mindedness or approaching problems in a disciplined and orderly way, which is systematicity, or being curious and inquisitive, or having critical thinking maturity. Now, to clarify the difference between a skill and a disposition, a skill is something you're able to do. A disposition is what you are actually inclined to do. So it's related to your character. So you may be skilled at cooking, but hate cooking. So in this case, you'd have the skill of cooking, but you would not have the disposition to be a successful chef. Now, the objectivist school is the predominant school of thought in education. So you may hear teachers requiring students to provide evidence to support an argument, or evidence as necessary to hold a justified belief, or even talk about the importance of being objective and identifying biases. Whereas the subjectivist school has a different perspective related to the uses and limits and purpose of critical thinking. They reject the claim that critical thinking is primarily about seeking to be objective or correct, or to identify and correct biases. For example, subjectivists raise questions about evidence, such as what qualifies as evidence, or how much evidence makes a belief justified, or within whose framework of assumptions. So what I want to do tonight is unpack this debate and then propose a model of critical thinking rooted in my Christian worldview that attempts to build on some of the strengths in both schools of thought. Okay, I have another quick activity for you. And as Barb mentioned, you're going to use the chat for this activity. You may have seen this picture before, but in the chat, I want you to tell me whether you see this shoe as pink and white or teal and gray, or maybe even a different color combination. Just drop your answers in the chat. We have about 1 minute for you to do that. So if you look at this, as people are putting these in the chat, you can see that there's a difference of opinion. White and pink, or white and pink, teal and gray. Some saying, I can't see either of them, right? So there seems to be no consensus on what we're looking at. Now, the reason I have you do this activity is that this is a simple example that demonstrates that our brains interpret inputs differently. Different people looking at the same input see different things. And when we talk about research on cultural thinking, the key question is, how does culture impact the way our brains interpret the world? Do humans engage in reasoning in similar ways across cultures? To think critically, do you have to disregard or ignore your cultural context? And does critical thinking necessarily mean the same thing in different cultural contexts? Now, there's a growing body of research that supports the idea that our culture significantly impacts the way our brains think about and interpret the world. For example, a study at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT used MRIs to monitor the brain activity of native English and native Chinese speakers, and then gave both groups similar intellectual tasks. And the results showed that the two different groups use different regions of their brains to answer the same questions. And the neuroscience of culture has wide-ranging implications for how we understand cultural ways of thinking and, by extension, critical thinking. Similarly, researchers looking at language and the theory of linguistic relativity talk about linguistic modes of thinking. And this is the idea that the languages we grow up with shape our understanding of the world. For example, there are certain words in Arabic that capture a feeling or experience that I don't know how to express in English. And Cliff Goddard, who is a professor of linguistics at Griffith University in Australia, points out that the key question is not how much language influences thinking, but rather in what ways does the process of linguistic thinking differ from language to language, since we do not think outside the confines of language. Some behavioral researchers are exploring the way that social, ecological, and cultural differences affect the way that humans interpret the world. So they contend that this research should lead to a reevaluation of cognitive theories about thinking. For example, Richard Nisbett argues that East Asians think holistically, make relatively little use of categories and formal logic, and rely on what he calls dialectical reasoning, which emphasizes change, accepts contradiction, and searches for the middle way between opposing propositions. Whereas Westerners are more analytic. They detach ideas from their context, they focus on a central object or person and its attributes, and reason about it using categories and rules. So the goal of Asian dialectical reasoning, as seen in the research of Richard Nisbett, is social cohesion based on harmony and an avoidance of confrontation and debate. Whereas the goal of Western analytic thought is centered on debating attributes and ideas using the rules of formal logic. So when we talk about the art of critical thinking, we need to start by acknowledging that our social, cultural, linguistic experience shapes the way we think about and interpret the world. It's not a question of whether or how much culture impacts our thinking, but instead it's an understanding that all of our thinking on some level is cultural and linguistic. Now, practically speaking, that means that we each interpret the world through a framework of assumptions that grow out of our social, linguistic, cultural, and educational experiences. And when I talk about a framework of assumptions, in simple terms, an assumption is something that you believe to be true or value without necessarily having to think about it. And sometimes we are aware of our assumptions, but much of the time we are not. For example, if I say President Biden issued a vaccine mandate, this is a statement of fact, but people will give positive, negative, or neutral meaning to the statement based on their assumptions. If a person responds positively to the statement, it may reveal an assumption about the seriousness of the threat of COVID. If someone responds negatively, it may reveal an assumption about the insignificance of the threat. If someone is neutral, that person may not care either way or feel that the mandate doesn't affect them or impact them. But if you dig deeper, the response may unearth assumptions about the relative importance of safety or individual freedom or civic responsibility or economic prosperity. It may, if you dig a little deeper, get to the framework of the role or power of the government and its responsibilities or limits. And so my point is that our assumptions frame how we interpret and understand everything we hear or read or study. They're the lenses through which we evaluate and make sense of information. And a key disagreement between the objective and subjectivist schools is to what extent are we able to reason outside the sociocultural framework and lenses through which we see the world. So there's three concepts that I believe can help clarify the uses and limits of critical thinking, and these concepts are coherence, consistency, and accuracy. So let's start with coherence. When we talk about coherence, we're talking about a set of beliefs, values, and ideas about reality that fit together within a particular framework of assumptions. So if you have a postmodern worldview, it's rooted in relativism or postmodern assumptions, then a coherent worldview fits ideas, beliefs, and values together within that frame. If you have a traditional worldview rooted in the Christian religious tradition, or it's rooted in Christian assumptions, then a coherent worldview fits ideas, beliefs, and values together again within that frame. So if a Taoist who believes in reincarnation, a Taoist can have a coherent worldview, meaning that his or her beliefs, values, and ideas fit together coherently within the framework of Taoist assumptions about the world. But you'll see that I've also intentionally left a few missing pieces in each of these worldviews. That's because human knowledge, all human knowledge is limited, and every worldview has missing pieces or unanswered questions. Now, the second word that we're going to look at is consistency. So when we talk about consistency, we are looking at the relationship between assumptions, inferences, which are the way we interpret our experience or the conclusions we draw from our experience, ideas, values, beliefs, and actions, which is the way we choose to live in the world. So for example, if someone claims to have a traditional Christian worldview, but what they say contradicts the values of a traditional Christian worldview, or how they behave indicates that they reject the beliefs of their stated worldview, then they lack consistency between assumptions, inferences, values, ideas, and actions. Or if a person is passionately protesting against global warming, while at the same time drinking coffee out of a styrofoam cup, we may recognize inconsistency between assumptions, beliefs, and actions. Now, to be fair to the women in this picture, I superimposed the styrofoam cup on them, so they weren't really drinking a styrofoam cup. But if they were, the worldview may be coherent, but lack consistency between assumptions, beliefs, and actions. Now, the final word that I want to talk about is accuracy or correctness. When we talk about accuracy, we are making a claim about how closely a perspective corresponds to the way things actually exist in the world. So accurate knowledge reflects how the world operates independent of human constructs and beliefs. Now, a reasonable explanation is consistent with its own coherent assumptions, but may not accurately represent the way the world operates. So reincarnation may be coherent, and someone who accepts that worldview may make consistent choices based on their assumptions, but that does not mean that reincarnation therefore corresponds accurately to the way the world actually is. Similarly, if you interpreted this shoe as teal and gray, you may see it that way consistently. The way you describe it and the way that you talk about it may be coherent, but this is not a teal and gray shoe. It is actually a pink and white shoe, which means your reasonable, coherent, and consistent interpretation is inaccurate. Now, again, to clarify, human knowledge is limited and fallible. So on some level, it is never completely accurate. And every person's individual knowledge is also limited and fallible. But my assumption is that it's possible for a point of view to be closer to or further from the way things actually are in the world, to be more or less accurate. So we have those three concepts. So keep those in mind: coherence, consistency, and accuracy. Now, if we're going to talk about critical thinking, a lot of times critical thinking is associated with being logical or rational. Some of you chose that, one of you, I think, chose that as a logical criteria. So I want to describe just briefly the difference between logical thinking and rational thinking, and then talk a little bit about what it means to be rational. So logical thinking is related to the validity of a claim or an argument. So does the claim of the argument fit together based on the rules of logic? So in this case, an argument can be logical and valid, but inaccurate or not true. For example, the argument that all toasters are items made of gold, all items made of gold are time travel devices, and therefore all toasters are time travel devices, is a logical argument. It is valid and it is consistent. But it's not true or accurate because the premises, the foundational assumptions about toasters, gold, and time travel devices are false. And so for our purpose, I'm not going to focus on formal logic or validity, but I did want to make that distinction. Instead, I'm going to focus on rational thinking. What is rational thinking? And when I talked about accuracy, I stated that a reasonable explanation is consistent with its own coherent assumptions. But for example, if I assume, how do we understand this? For example, if I assume that it's my responsibility to retire with financial independence, and this is a worthwhile objective, then it is reasonable for me to set aside money now each month for retirement. Whereas if I believe that it's my children's responsibility to support me in my old age, then it's reasonable for me to spend my money on other things now. And so our assumptions impact the consistency, coherence, and reasonableness of our actions. Now, rational thinking is distinguished from reasonable thinking in that when we talk about rational thinking, it means that we elevate the importance of evidence, we minimize the influence of emotion, that I understand why I'm believing or doing something, I understand the end I am trying to achieve and why, and then I act in accordance with the decisions that I reach without allowing emotional influences to persuade me to act or believe in a different way. And so I base my beliefs and actions on reliable evidence or the best available evidence. So if critical thinking is rational thinking, then we're talking about coherence in that I understand the bigger question of why we believe something or do something, how ideas and beliefs and actions fit together within the framework of our assumptions. That I'm committed to act in accordance with decisions that I reach without allowing emotional influence to persuade me or to act or believe in a different way. And that I am basing my beliefs and actions on reliable, credible, or the best available evidence. And so a key difference between objectivist and subjectivist schools is how they answer the question, can different cultural frameworks of assumptions be rational? So now we're going to explore a few of your assumptions. And again, in the chat, what I want you to do is I've given you a list of 6 items here. And I want you to rank the following from the most credible to the least credible forms of evidence. So for example, if you think dreams and visions are the most credible, most reliable form of evidence, you would put that first in your list in the chat. If you think dreams and visions are the least credible form of evidence, you'd put that last in the list on the chat. And so I want you have about 2 minutes and just drop those, think through it, and then put them in the order that you think in the chat. That when I have done this exercise with individuals from different backgrounds, there's been a great deal of variation in the order of how these types of evidence are ranked. So if we have similarities, it tells us something about the group of people that are together. But I have often had complete opposite lists in my classes of similar individuals. And what this ranking demonstrates is it demonstrates that our foundational assumptions, that our worldview lenses impact how we determine and evaluate what qualifies as reliable or credible evidence. If within a framework of my assumptions, I think that scriptural support is more credible or reliable than a scientific test, then on some level, how I understand rational thinking will be different than somebody who ranks a scientific test above that of scriptural support, potentially, or personal experience, or dreams and visions. However you ranked it, or however a person ranks it, will lead to different understandings of what is considered rational thinking. And anthropologist Richard Schwader calls this difference in what is rational divergent rationalities. And so he states the presuppositions and premises, which I have called foundational assumptions, from which a person reasons, the metaphors, the analogies, and models used for generating explanations, the categories or classification used for partitioning objects and events into kinds, and the types of evidence that are viewed as authoritative. The version of reality we construct is a product of both the universal and the non-universal rational processes. But it's because not all rational processes are universal that we need a concept of divergent rationality. Now, I know that's a big statement, but what he means in that, by a universal rational process, is that there is a shared way, that a common pattern that people use in reasoning. So for example, the general pattern of moving from an observation to an inference, to an interpretation, to an action, based on our foundational assumptions. So this is a shared reasoning pattern. If you go through different cultures around the world, you'll find a similar pattern being shared. But what he means by a non-universal rational process is that the framework, the presuppositions and premises, again, what I've called our foundational framework of assumptions, that shape how we understand the meaning of our life, will also impact the types of evidence that are viewed as authoritative and how a person evaluates and understands evidence as they attempt to reach rational conclusions. So he is claiming that when we're talking about what it means to be rational, it's difficult to argue conclusively for many foundational beliefs without what is called circular reasoning. So circular reasoning is when an argument assumes the truth of the conclusions instead of supporting it. So for example, God exists because the world could not have been created without God. That's circular reasoning. Or the supernatural is not real because I have never experienced anything supernatural. That is also circular reasoning. Or the Apple iPhone's the best smartphone on the planet because no one makes a better smartphone than Apple. So whether or not it's true, it is circular reasoning. So Schwader is arguing that all of our inputs from birth to death go into shaping our understanding of what is rational and real. And these foundational assumptions are embedded in our socio-cultural location. So what we're taught in our families of origin, what we're taught in our schools, what's modeled in the behavior of those around us, what's absorbed in the TV shows we watch, or the YouTube videos we consume, or the social media that we participate in. And as we've seen, even language and culture may go into how our brains are wired. In this case, critical thinking may not be about whether I am more rational or you are more rational. Instead, it may be concerned with understanding how different frameworks of assumptions evaluate and understand what qualifies as good evidence and what is therefore rational. Now, before you're too convinced, objectivist Harry Siegel wants to come in and say, wait, no. He disagrees with Schwader and argues that cultures are diverse and divergent, but rationality is not. And what he is arguing is that to be rational is to have a belief that's supported by credible evidence that is subject to evaluation. So what does he mean? He means that the claim that the earth is flat may have explanatory appeal. People may be drawn to it. It may have explanatory power. Someone looking at the ground say, it looks flat to me, or look off into the horizon. It may be coherent and consistent with foundational assumptions that question satellite imagery or believe in government conspiracies, but it is irrational because there is evidence that is subject to evaluation that decisively proves that the earth is round. Now, what is missing in this discussion is the recognition that there's different types of questions And different types of questions are subject to different sets of criteria for how we evaluate what qualifies as good evidence. So scientists, religious leaders, ethicists, and judges use different sets of criteria for evaluating evidence based on the type of questions that they are asked or being asked to answer. So the standards adopted are based on shared sets of assumptions that correlate with the purpose of the reasoning activity and the nature of the questions being asked. Now, when someone claims the earth is flat, there's decisive evidence that is subject to evaluation that demonstrates that the earth is round. But when someone claims that we are reincarnated after we die, this is a different type of question that cannot yield decisive evidence that's subject to evaluation without circular reasoning. So the disagreement here between Schrader and Siegel, or the objectivist and subjectivist schools, is to what extent do criteria for evaluating evidence exist outside or inside our frameworks of assumptions? All right, so our final question to consider, exploring assumptions, is related to critical thinking values. And so I'm going to launch a poll here again. And in this poll, I want you to answer the question, do you think critical thinking should be taught in every culture? Yes or no? Do you think the values of critical thinking promote multicultural understanding? Yes or no? And then which of the following types of thinking do you believe is most important to develop through critical thinking instruction? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, one of the most important differences between the objectivist and subjectivist schools of critical thinking is related to its purpose and values. So we talked about this difference where objectivists will emphasize things like autonomy or independence or self-sufficiency or a democratic spirit or questioning authority or impartiality, with the idea that the objective is to have rational, justified belief, whereas the subjectivists will focus on multicultural understanding or interdependence, coexistence, empathy, social connectivity, respect, with the idea that the goal or the aim of critical thinking is rational, multicultural understanding. Now, subjectivist scholars argue that the objectivist model of critical thinking are biased against non-Western cultures because they neglect or downplay emotions, that they elevate rational linear thought over intuition, that they prioritize effective thinking over morality and meaningfulness, that they're aggressive and confrontational rather than collegial and collaborative, that they're individualistic and emphasize autonomy over a sense of community and relationship, and that they assume the possibility of objectivity and downplay the significance of cultural situatedness. Now, they don't just claim that critical thinking carries these values, but they say that this is actually imbued with Western values, that these aren't simply critical thinking values, these are clearly Western values. When I talk about autonomy or individualism or independence or egalitarianism or linear thinking, when I talk about a democratic spirit or authority questioning, I'm really promoting Western values. And as such, to teach or focus on the objectivist model of critical thinking in education is not a neutral activity. It's an ideological activity, meaning it by its nature is seeking to change or challenge a particular culture's set of values and way of engaging in the world. For example, to ask a student to question authority in a culture where it's considered shameful to directly challenge your elders is to ask that student to change his or her cultural values. To ask a student to think like an individual when his or her culture values and emphasizes the group over the individual is to ask the student to change cultural values, which leads some subjectivist scholars to argue that the objectivist model of critical thinking is just another way to say Western scientific thinking. So in rejecting the normative values of the objectivist school of thought, then in the subjectivist school of thought, the values become more fluid. Some still talk about autonomy. Others emphasize empathy or mutual understanding as what is most important, the most important value of critical thinking. Others talk about morality or dialogue or meaningfulness, and argue that the essence of critical thinking is about asking questions. And still others talk about social connectivity and coexistence as the primary values of critical thinking. And so what I want to point out here is that the charge of bias is not necessarily negative. Both objectivist and subjectivist scholars recognize that all knowledge is situated or contextual and therefore includes bias. The issue is not whether or not the values of critical thinking are biased, but instead whether or not the biases of critical thinking are good. So if critical thinking is biased but good, then it should be implemented based on its values. So the central question is not really about bias, but whether critical thinking is a good, moral, or educationally valuable endeavor, either globally or within a particular context. For example, if we believe that the values of independence and autonomy and questioning authority and a democratic spirit are good in every culture, the fact that these are Western values is irrelevant. So to bring this together, we see that at the heart of the debate is a disagreement over the purpose of critical thinking. Is it rational justified belief? Is it rational multicultural understanding? The nature of the standards used for evaluating evidence and making judgments, whether or not rationality can exist outside the framework of our assumptions. They're talking about different sets of values, and they're talking about different types of biases. Now, as a cross-cultural Christian educator, I wrestle with how the goals of critical thinking instruction interact with the values of different cultural contexts, as well as the values of my faith. And so I ask myself whether or not seeking to transform culturally specific values through critical thinking instruction is justified, or whether it's possible to develop contextual forms of critical thinking, or if critical thinking should simply be promoted as specifically Western education, as a Western educational ideal. So as long as critical thinking continues to be one of the goals of education, it's important to work toward understanding the complicated relationship between culture, critical thinking, and faith. And so to conclude, and we are going to go a little past the hour point here because I want to weave this all together. To conclude, I want to walk you through how I approach critical thinking as a Christian in a multicultural world, with the caveat that this is still a work in progress for me, that I still continue to wrestle and work this out. And so when I ask myself this question, I look at how my theology, how my experience, and how my academic study have contributed to my understanding. And these three areas work together dynamically. They do not actually exist as separate categories, but it's helpful to break it down this way. So a few theological beliefs that impact my perspective are that we live in a fallen world, which means human reason is fallible, that human action is often unjust. So systemic injustice or unequal power relationships in the world are a result of human action. The human tendency towards self-centeredness and the prideful elevation of our own understanding is a part of the fallen world we live in. At the same time, God's common grace exists in the world such that aspects of God's truth are revealed in and through human cultures and creation. So for example, in creation, I see God's creativity. I see God's love of diversity. I also see that humans are created in the image of God, which means I have the responsibility to respect every human's intrinsic worth and dignity. That I recognize the positive potential in human curiosity, human rationality, and artistry. And that seeking to understand is an inherently worthwhile endeavor that leads to a richer human experience. And that at some extent, human flourishing is possible within the limitations of a fallen world. And with that, I also believe that the gospel is true despite human limitations. And that as followers of Jesus, our call is to be both peacemakers and message bearers in the world. So that's kind of a framework of theology. My experience is that I've lived cross-culturally, and I am in a cross-cultural marriage where I've seen that different cultural patterns exist for how to be in the world, different views of marriage, different views of parenthood, different understandings of education, that I see and have experienced enculturated values that exist at a deep unconscious level. My wife and I have had many times where she says, well, that's just wrong. And I say, well, it's just right. And neither of us can say why, because those values are just at an unconscious level that come out of our culture. I've seen that there's positive and negative aspects of different sets of cultural values. So there's positive aspects to individualism, and there's positive aspects to collectivism, and there's negative aspects of both. There's positive aspects of questioning authority and positive aspects of respecting authority, and again, negative aspects of both. And through teaching in a Muslim context, I've experienced a deeper understanding and respect for how people who are different from me construct and make sense of the world. And I've seen the valuable contributions made to humanity through Islamic culture. And then academically, which I've walked you through a little bit in this last hour, my academic study has reaffirmed the existence of multiple worldviews, cultural norms, different assumptions. It helps me see the valuable contributions from a variety of people and cultures. It helps me better understand the limits of my own understanding and gives me categories to help me work out my views of the world and faith, and language that help me define and categorize my understanding. So my theology experience and academic study lead me to understand the purpose of critical thinking as a way to promote better self-understanding, as a way to promote a more empathetic understanding of others, as a way to encourage meaningful dialogue, and as a way to live with thoughtful conviction in the world. Now, I also recognize that the results of critical thinking instruction may lead people either toward or away from Jesus. And so here it is, what you've all been waiting for those who have to leave at the hour, I'm sorry, you're just gonna have to come back next time. I'm gonna weave this all together in a model of critical thinking that I have called critical thinking as faith-seeking understanding, which is a phrase that I'm borrowing from St. Anselm. And I will describe this with the following model. So if we look at this Venn diagram, region 1 represents general reasoning patterns that are shared across culture. So this is what Schrader called universal rational processes. This is that general pattern of moving from observation to inference to interpretation to action based on assumptions. These are shared reasoning patterns that I would argue are universal. But region 2 represents general frameworks of assumptions or interpretations that are shared by some cultures, but not all cultures. So for example, when Richard Nisbet talks about Asian dialectic thinking and Western analytic thinking, he's broadly comparing systematic differences or similarities that represent particular cultural patterns of reasoning shared by some, but not shared by others. So for example, the scenario that I discussed earlier about whether financial stability at retirement is the responsibility of the individual or the group, you might find similar views in Europe and the US, but you might find that in India and the Arab world, you find very different understandings of that question. So in these scenarios, particular cultural assumptions and values can lead to different sets of priorities that are used to make decisions that are considered rationally justified. And then region 3 represents the idea that on some level, different cultural frameworks and individuals have unique patterns of thinking that are specific to themselves and their own context. So that shared patterns of thinking break down at some point, they become individualistic patterns of interpretation. Now, this all happens within the bounds and limitations of what is called bounded rationality, which simply means we all must make decisions in spite of having intellectual limits, as well as having limited information. So this is the basic framework that I believe critical thinking must work within. So the first step or stage of this model is critical thinking and faith. Now, by faith, I don't mean religious faith. In this context, faith means frameworks of assumptions and values that are embedded in sociocultural, linguistic, and educational experiences that we inherit or that we largely accept as we grow up because we trust the authority of our families or our schools or our friends or our media inputs. So that's what I mean by faith, these authorities that we trust. And to some extent, all people have faith-based worldviews that shape their foundational assumptions and interpretations of the world in which they live. And many of our faith-based foundational assumptions cannot be proven or disproven conclusively without circular reasoning. And as we've discussed, how different groups or cultures define what constitutes a good reason varies across contexts. And divergent rationalities means that there are rational explanations that make good sense of the world based on evidence, but have different sets of foundational assumptions. So in stage one, the pursuit of coherence and consistency is what we are looking for. The process of thinking critically focuses on the relationship between assumptions, inferences, beliefs, and actions towards the end of consistency and coherence in my worldview. So it helps us examine our own paradigms for evaluating the credibility of evidence. On this level, critical thinking helps us identify our values and beliefs about the purpose of life. Again, looking for coherence and consistency. Do our ideas, beliefs, and values fit together coherently? And do we live out those convictions consistently? And so the primary goal at this first stage is to use skills and dispositions of critical thinking as a self-reflective, self-diagnostic tool that's focused on understanding and evaluating the coherence and consistency in our own perspectives. And at this stage, critical thinking is not concerned with accuracy or how closely a perspective corresponds to the way things are in the world. Okay, so the second step or stage involves critical thinking and seeking understanding of the other. So global critical thinking involves identifying foundational assumptions and looking for coherence and consistency in the process of assumptions, inferences, beliefs, and actions in other worldviews, in multiple faith worldviews. And so the aim of the second stage of critical thinking is to promote multicultural understanding, to promote respect, to develop the skills to use logic, local and global critical thinking to engage in constructive dialogue. At this stage, the goal is not persuasion, it's not convincing, it's not judging right from wrong. The goal is to engage in dialogue to understand the consistency and coherence of other worldviews, as well as to identify which of our foundational assumptions, values, and purposes are shared and which are different. So in stages 1 and 2, we work on the skills and dispositions to deeply question a personal framework of thought, an ability to reconstruct sympathetically and imaginatively the strongest version of oppositional frameworks of thought. At these stages, critical thinking is more concerned with coherence and consistency of how you think, as opposed to the accuracy of what you think. And it includes skills like assumption identification, deduction, and dispositions like humility and open-mindedness. But it also understands that critical thinking is an autonomous act that occurs in a social context. So although autonomy is important, there is also the importance of having sensitivity to the implications of our social context as we make coherent, consistent, and rational choices. So a critical thinker needs to consider all the influences of choice that go into making a decision, such as emotional, cultural, and professional consequences of a belief. And then the final stage, or stage 3, is critical thinking as seeking an understanding of the truth. So this is the evaluative stage. So after a person has demonstrated the skill to understand the strengths and weaknesses of his or her own worldview, as well as other worldviews, and demonstrated critical thinking dispositions of respect, humility, and conversation with divergent worldviews, he or she can then move on to the final stage, which involves evaluating which foundational assumptions are the most accurate. And this stage is based on the belief that it's possible to understand the truth claims and cultural assumptions of different perspectives and still make judgments concerning the accuracy or correctness of the claims. So evaluation of foundational assumptions is a form of moral reasoning, which again is a higher level activity in this model. Evaluation is a necessary component of the development of thoughtful convictions in the process of seeking understanding. So the processes of these three stages are, just a minute here. Yeah. To evaluate which assumption level did I say, yeah, I see. Right. To evaluate which assumption level differences in different worldviews challenge our own beliefs, to evaluate why we find a particular set of assumptions convincing, which is not always based on intellectual reasons, to identify further areas for growth, and again, to promote a life of thoughtful conviction as people engage with and in the world. So you'll see in general, this model is more closely aligned with the subjectivist school of thought in that its primary concern is with meaning and understanding, although it does employ analytic methods and skills in a way that I believe can be used across intellectual disciplines and cultures. But the model promotes specific values such as respect, multicultural understanding, and thoughtful conviction, which I would argue are good for every culture. Now, the ultimate goal is the ability to live out a life of thoughtful conviction with a respect for others. So to tie it all together, we're almost done. Give me 2 more minutes. Some of the assumptions of this model are that there are different kinds of reasoning in the world. There are different kinds of evidence. Our view of evidence and reasoning shaped by our culture and religious assumptions, that we all engage with the world from a point of view and we all have biases, and that there is a difference between coherence, consistency, and accuracy. The activities that we engage in are the intellectual skills like identifying assumptions, but also dispositions such as humility and truth-seeking. It includes evaluating coherence and consistency in our own worldview and looking at coherence and consistency in other worldviews. And done this way, it leads to constructive dialogue that promotes a life of thoughtful conviction. And so the outcomes that I'm looking to assess as an educator are the outcomes of respectful multiculturalism, personal growth. It's a relationship building exercise that promotes self-understanding and the understanding of others, as well as a way to engage with thoughtful conviction in the world. So where does my faith fit into all of this? You might have noticed I don't make explicit references to my faith, but I hope you can see that what I've said aligns with my theological perspective that I pointed out. Now, finally, holistic transformation is one of ideas' core values. And so I do want to point out when we talk about transformation that I believe conversion from one faith worldview to another is something that generally occurs outside the domain of critical thinking. Conversion is usually not moving from an inconsistent framework of belief to a consistent framework of belief. It's moving from one set of foundational assumptions about the nature of reality and humanity to another set of foundational assumptions about the nature of reality and humanity and God. And this type of change, at least in the model that I've proposed, is only possible at stage 3. But the model of faith-seeking, critical thinking as faith-seeking understanding is one way to promote meaningful dialogue, which, if implemented, can contribute to transformation, to helping people hear and understand the message of the gospel, whether they accept or reject it, as well as the ability to live as peacemakers and message bearers in a multicultural world. So this is the foundation of my approach to teaching. And with that said, I can then begin to think about how to contextualize or implement based on these values. So I've presented a lot of information. I realize that. The webinar is entitled The Art of Critical Thinking because I believe that navigating values, assumptions, evidence, and belief in the pursuit of thoughtful convictions is just that. It's an artistic expression of worship to God. So thank you for giving me your time. That is the end of the webinar portion. We'll take a short break, and then I am happy to spend the next 20 minutes answering any questions that you might have.